My name is Eric Contreras. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Abe for the possibility of allowing ADAAG Consulting Service, our firm, to work with the Pensacola Area Housing Commission in this project. We are grateful for this opportunity, and we definitely think this project will have fruits in the end, and we will meet our goal of providing accessibility within the housing service. Right now, I would like to tell you that the speaker on your end is actually muted, because right now, otherwise we could start getting feedback and interruptions. So I will be doing most of the talking. However, any time that you would like to make a question or something like that, there is a tab bar where you can actually like text in your questions. So please feel free to send in any questions you have, or otherwise we will have a space towards the end of the presentation where we can go ahead and address all of these questions. Currently, as we said, so let's get started. And basically, the name of this presentation is Section 504, UFAS, FHA, and ADA for public housing authorities. What we are trying to do with this is basically the goal of this will be to review the federal requirements for public housing and measures to comply with the requirements. Where I left off, I was actually giving a little bit of the background on this. So our firm, ADAAG Consulting Services, was retained by the Pensacola Area Housing Commission to perform the accessibility transition plan. And a little bit of story on our firm. Our firm provides accessibility consulting services to both private companies as well as public entities throughout the country. We provide accessibility consulting, architecture, engineering, but our area of expertise is accessibility consulting, and primarily with public housing authorities. We do focus on their needs and services, as well as for like Department of Transportation. We help them in assisting their developing their transition plan for public rights of way, as well as for other school boards and educational facilities. Right now, we have either completed or we have ongoing contracts with North Carolina, in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and California, to name others. So definitely, it's something that we have found that is in need basically throughout the country, and that is the area where we have specialized right now. Okay, so now starting with our presentation, as I mentioned, it's going to be a quick review of the federal requirements for the public housing, and how to comply with these measures, and the best practices that we can implement in achieving these measures. So we're going to start by going over the background. This is not something new. This has been out for quite a couple of years, and there's different laws and regulations to apply into all this. And as we will see, what happens is also there's like some type of level of cross coverage where one can overlap with the other, but basically all these elements will come into play. So we will go over some in more detail than others. The ones that are more applicable, I feel we will go into a little bit more depth, while others we're just going to go over, briefly, just because they will probably not be as applicable, if you will, to the Pensacola Area Housing Commission. The main ones that we're looking at, well, the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. Then there was also Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This established the UFAS, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. Their operative date was roughly around 1988. The Fair Housing Accessibility Act. The Fair Housing Act basically had a date of, I believe it was March 15th, 1991. And the ADA, which basically there was the first ADA out back in 1992, and just recently the 2010 ADA that has just become enforceable as of March 15th, 2012. And being that we are in Florida, we also have the Florida Building Code that also became effective. The new code has become effective as of March 15, 2012. So we're going to go a little bit into these and just kind of explain the specific requirements that it entails for public housing authorities. Starting with Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act. This, well, was conceived in its inception, and basically it applies to public entities receiving federal funds, and in this case, multifamily housing was substantially altered after July 1988. So we can see that this one is clearly where has a clear direct impact on the Pensacola Area Housing Commission and many housing authorities throughout the country. And this is one of the main mandating regulations that HUD, enforces upon basically on the housing authorities. Now, in a nutshell, basically what this does is that it prohibits discrimination and different, basically on disability, sex, and marital status, a whole bunch of different categories. But in a nutshell, basically what this is to prohibit discrimination and like I said, on basis of disability. It also establishes certain requirements, if you will, to provide reasonable accommodation for qualified applicants. So basically, in some events, the governments might not have to make all of the facilities accessible, but they do have to provide a certain basic level of accommodation to persons that have disabilities and so forth. Also establishes requirements for new construction, whereas new construction has to be fully compliant, and alterations that have to try to meet the new construction requirements, but to the maximum extent feasible, as well as for public housing. And this one clearly establishes, which is what is most important for us at this point, is that it sets the UFAS as the standard as for what is accessible. So what we will see is that there are different entities and standard setting agencies such as HUD. HUD has basically been following the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards throughout all this period, and to this point is doing that. Even now that the 2010 ADA has been issued, they have not adopted these codes as of yet. They have not issued any statements. So we will see that there are certain differences between the UFAS standards and the ADA standards. More importantly is that the UFAS standards, they have specific requirements for accessible dwelling units, and that is something that is not contained in DA, as we will see. So this one obviously will give us most of our guidance, and this is probably where we are going to focus on. Also, under Section 504, it establishes specific requirements for transition plan. Basically, a transition plan, what it is that because a lot of these programs have been in place for many years, at one point or another, they have to be evaluated. So the premise or the intent is to basically do a self-evaluation of these programs, review them, basically policies, procedures, and physical accessibilities, physical access, and identify deficiencies in these programs and services, identify methods to correct the deficiencies, establish a schedule to mitigate these deficiencies, and ultimately also establish the person that will be responsible for mitigating these deficiencies. Another important part that is set forth under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is the specific requirements for the public housing authorities under these under their housing programs to provide a minimum of accessible dwelling units. And it differentiates in two types. Number one, units that are designed for persons with mobility impairments, and it requires a minimum of 5%, and also units that are designed for persons with hearing and vision impairments, and for that it sets a minimum of 2%. Now, something that we must keep in mind is that these are, let's say, minimum thresholds that must be met. So what this means is that there is not a problem if we can exceed these, but we certainly do not want to be below this. Basically, the federal standards will always set these minimum thresholds, not a ceiling, not a cap, but a minimum that has to be met. So based on that is where we start with the requirements for establishing how many accessible units must be provided at the sites. Okay, as we mentioned, Section 504 determines that what is accessible is construction that is designed and built in compliance with the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. So Under the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, there are two types of requirements. There are specific scoping requirements, which a scoping requirement will tell us how many and what areas the requirements are applicable to, and then another type, which is technical requirements. Technical requirements will tell us what elements that were determined by the scoping, what they have to comply with. So for example, under the accessible site and exterior facilities, the scoping will tell us the amount of parking spaces that are required to comply with the guidelines. And the technical requirements will tell us the specific requirements that this parking space has to comply with. For example, a 2% slope in every direction, the dimensions of the parking space, and if it must have a signage and so forth. So that's kind of how the guidelines are structured. And there are specific components. Well, it's all pretty much applicable to the housing programs that housing authorities have, and we'll see that I have listed some of the ones that will be, that we were going to go through, which is, accessible site and exterior facilities, basically the requirement of providing accessible routes throughout the facility and the parking spaces, space allowances, reach ranges, accessible routes, ramps, curb ramps, stairs, elevators, doors, drinking fountains, signage, and common use restrooms. We're going to start going into this part to the technical requirements that the UFAS sets forth. And the reason of this is because there are some of these elements that are like building blocks, if you will. Think of them as Legos. Once we understand the general concept behind these elements, these will be applicable throughout the developments. And towards the end of our presentation, we will see specific examples and pictures depicting how these specific requirements apply and how, in the best practice, basically how we can implement when we do modifications to the premises. And also we must understand that currently the Pensacola Area Housing Commission is undergoing a process of updating and making the units, basically making modifications to units to make them comply with accessibility. So that is the first step in this whole process. Now, after this, there will be an ongoing obligation basically to maintain these accessible features and, the upkeep, as we will see, based on these requirements. So the first one is the clear floor space. And think of this as if one of us is standing up, this would be like the equivalent for somebody, and a lot of these will go to what a wheelchair is. The specific requirements of space for somebody seated in a wheelchair. So the minimum requirement for that is actually 30 inches wide by 48 inches long, and that is what is called a clear floor space. So basically, whenever we think of any element that is within one of these dwelling units or in an office or along any of the paths, we must think that somebody must have access to this element, either it be the mailbox, either if it is a vending machine or counter, but somebody has to have this 30 by 48 inch clear floor space in front of that element to be able to access it. So that is just when they're standing. But what happens when they are moving? When they are moving, that clear floor space is widened, if you will, and basically from it being a minimum to pass through a point of 32 inches, it has to be 36 inches continuous. So what we must think of at this point is basically providing an accessible route to each one of these elements. I'd like to think of it as the yellow brick road, a path that as a person, anybody can go from point A to point B, think of it from going from the public sidewalk, from the bus stop into the leasing office, into the accessible dwelling unit, going to the parking space, going to the different amenities, maybe a playground or an office, and all the way to basically the interior of the unit, to every single one of the rooms, to the living room, to the bathroom, the kitchen, dining, and any exterior areas that there might be, maybe a porch or a clothes drying line that's outside. So the concept is basically providing a minimum level of accessibility from point A to point B where somebody can navigate throughout the entire site and throughout the units. Now, in addition to the clear space for a stationary person seated on a wheelchair and that continuous path throughout the site, also there is another requirement that just like any of us can just basically turn around at one point and start heading back, and we're not going to walk backwards, but we're just going to turn around and face the opposite way. The same is applicable to a person on a wheelchair. So a minimum standard has been set for this, and it's called the turning space. So that turning space is considered a 60-inch diameter, where that's the minimum where somebody can approach in a wheelchair, make a U-turn, and head back forth from the way they were coming from. And that's depicted in the diagram that's on the left side with those two arrows. Somebody headed in one direction, let's say down, and they turn around and then they head back up north. So basically that's the concept of the turning space. And we will see that in general, the UFAS requirement establishes that where there are accessible spaces and elements, we must have this level of turning space, whereas somebody can actually approach, enter, and exit. So that will be the concept that we will see predominantly like in bathrooms and in the kitchens. Now, there is an alternative for this turning space, and it is called the T-shape, and that is the diagram that is on the right side. Now, the T-shape basically is a method of making basically a turnaround, which is, kind of like if you were going in a car and you were to try to make a three-point entrance. And so what this does allow is that you approach from one side of the T, and from, let's say, from the center, you could go to either the left or the right, back up, and then turn around and head the other way. So when this is placed on if we were to see this from the top, this resembles a T-shape, and what the overall size of it is basically 60 by 60, but we can say that when you are in tight spaces such as restrooms, some people opt to provide the shape like this because it allows having different fixtures there, maybe like a water closet or a lavatory, and allows the person to just, in that confined space, be able to turn around without having to go to that 60-inch diameter turnaround space that we were mentioning. So we will see these elements, these building blocks, if you will, repeated throughout the specific requirements. Now, this is another very important one, and this is called the reach range. And basically, this is the concept or the idea behind this. Think of it, if we are standing up, we are allowed to raise our hand, and we can, go ahead and grab any element that's at any different height, but certainly we can reach any area 6 feet or something like that, just to put a number. So now if we think of this in terms of somebody that is seated on a wheelchair, their reach ranges are reduced, and there's a different requirement for side reach and for forward reach. The concept being that if somebody is trying to grab an object in front of them, a forward reach, the one that is located on the left side, their reach ranges are basically between 15 to 48 inches. Whereas on the side reach, somebody has a lot more access to move their hand, and they can reach for elements between 9 to 54 inches. Now, on purpose, I basically just included the forward reach, which is a little bit more limited. As I mentioned in the past, HUD has not adopted the new ADA, but the new ADA, it is going to a different requirement. It is reducing the requirement to 48 inches. So trying to keep in line with that, we strongly suggest that most of the elements that are located, that are, or altered or placed now, should follow this guidance and try to locate them at 48 inches. And we will see that this also will be repeated in the Fair Housing Act requirement. So it is a good practice, or the best practice, if you will, to locate these elements that have to be accessible up to 48 inches above the finished floor. And this applies to all accessible elements. We can think of coat hooks, shelves, storage, accessories, dispensers, paper towel dispensers, soap dispensers, and all these type of features, that they should be located within these reach ranges, ideally the 48 inches maximum. Okay. Another interesting element that is called for in the requirements is for protruding objects. And basically what this idea is that, as we can see in the diagram on the left side, a person that has low vision or vision impairments might use a cane to navigate throughout a space. And there are different techniques. One is the cane sweeping technique. Another one is, kind of utilizing walls to navigate going next to these walls. So what happens is that when there are elements that are mounted between 27 inches above the floor to 80 inches above the floor, these elements should not protrude more than 4 inches from the wall. Otherwise, they can become a protruding element where somebody can just bump into them and possibly hurt themselves. So what the goal will be that whenever there are elements throughout the sites, maybe in common areas or something like that, to look for elements that protrude no more than 4 inches. If they do, there are different techniques and simple ways of addressing these elements by placing a cane detectable element below them. You know, think of a planter or something like that, or something that will not be moved easily to avoid having these elements as protruding objects. Another requirement is for, and this is following the line of the, following the accessible routes, is the curb ramps. And these we'll see often, you know, many times basically provided when people have to navigate through curbs and when people need access from parking spaces into sidewalks and then to the facilities. So the main premise here is to basically provide a slope that is no more than 1 in 12. 1 in 12 is a ratio. Basically, that is that for every inch of rise, you need a horizontal projection or a distance of 12 inches. So in 1 foot, it will rise 1 inch. As simple as that. You know, 2 feet will be 24 inches, 3 feet, 36 inches, and so forth. Now, that is a maximum standard that is set. Nothing is to say that we design and build these elements with a lesser slope. And actually, the requirement calls for it to be the least possible slope. So many times we will see that some elements are right around the requirement, but they shouldn't be that. You know, when we have a requirement that is like this, that is setting a maximum, we should design well below this and have these elements so that they are fully compliant. Otherwise, if we try to design with or exactly at the requirement, it is likely that we can fail and the elements will be non-compliant. So, you know, it's best to try to avoid designing at that 1 in 12 slope, but try to do it a softer slope, you know, something definitely less to avoid being in non-compliance. And specific requirements for the curb ramps, not only, well, the main slope is 1 in 12, but the flare sides, in occasions when there are landings on top that are at least, you know, basically 48 inches, are allowed to have a 10% running slope, a 1 in 10%, which is a higher slope than this. But as I said, you know, these slopes are maximum, and we should design well below these to avoid being in non-compliance. At the same time, as you can see in that diagram on the lower left-hand corner, that just indicates the relationship between the 1 and the 12, what I mentioned, the change between the rise and the length of the ramp. And surfaces that are adjoining these ramps similarly should have no more than 5%. So if you think of a curb ramp for a parking space or something like that, that slope at that gutter should be no more than 5%, because otherwise the transition from that 5% to a 12% creates an area that can easily catch, well, a coaster, you know, for a wheelchair can get trapped in that area, and somebody can basically tend to tip it, move forward, and fall off their wheelchair. Now, continuing with accessible routes, ramps become part of accessible routes, and they have to follow the same requirements that accessible routes basically be the 36 inches long, 36 inches wide minimum, and that have no more than 2% cross slope. Now, ramps have to follow the same, you know, requirements for the curb ramps, that they have to have that 1 in 12 maximum slope. And because these ramps are sloped surfaces, what we will find is that there is a heightened requirement, that is to install handrails at these ramps. So we will see that for surfaces that rise over 6 inches or that are over 72 inches in long, they have to have handrails. And the handrails go on both sides of the ramp, not just on one. And this is one of the elements that we will see, and even in the pictures ahead, that tends to have problems, you know, for some strange reason, the design or the construction, a lot of these elements get left out and they don't have the handrails. Either they don't have it, they don't have the extensions, or they don't have handrails on both sides. but it is something that is quite common, that, as we will see. And there are some diagrams, as you can see. The height of the handrails should be, and there are some differences, but in UFAS, it specifically requires that that height be mounted between 30 to 34 inches above the finished floor to the top of the gripping surface. We'll see that the ADAAG requirement is between 34 to 38, so that's how these requirements vary from one standard to the other. Also, the handrail itself, the diameter should be 1¼ to 1½ inches in width, and also it has to have extensions basically 12 inches long at the end, at the top, and at the bottom. Another specific requirement for ramps is that once they rise over 30 inches, they are required to have a landing, and that landing, depending on if it is in just in one direction, it can be as wide as the ramp leading to it. Now, when you change directions, that landing has to have the 60-inch turnaround space that we have spoken in the past, so somebody in a wheelchair can actually wheel up to that landing, make the turnaround, and wheel to the opposite direction, basically to take the switchback or the other portion of the ramp. So the concepts of the building blocks of that turning space, they start repeating themselves throughout these elements. Okay. Another important element is doors. We'll see that the specific requirement under the UFAS for doors is that they have a 32-inch clear minimum width, and that is measured from the stop to the edge of the door. So it is a clear dimension. So basically what happens is that many times maybe an architect or a contractor will go ahead and spec out a 32-inch door, will not provide a 32-inch clearance because of the door jamb and the door width and all that. So basically you have to start, with 34 inches or more, or 36 inches to have that 32-inch clear minimum width. There are specific requirements regarding the hardware. It's supposed to have the lever type hardware, and also the threshold, which basically the threshold should not vary more than 1/4 inch vertical in height, and it can go up to a 1/2 inch, but it has to be beveled in a 1:2 ratio. Only sliding glass doors, I believe, are allowed a little bit more, but that's not the case in most cities, and especially in Florida. Our sliding glass doors usually tend to have a higher threshold than that 1/2 inch and 3/4. So another requirement for the doors is that they have what is called a maneuvering clearance. And so we are all on the same page with the maneuvering clearance. The maneuvering clearance requirement, what it is that think of this as you approach a door. When you approach a door, if you are going to open that door, and let's call this on the pull side, means when you are opening, when you're holding that knob and you are pulling it towards you. So at that point, you have to, let's say, get out of the way to be able to open that door. So for a person on a wheelchair, when opening a door, and we could also think of somebody on a walker, if you're pulling that door, you have to put that walker or that wheelchair clear out of the swing of that door to be able to open it all the way, and after it's open, be able to move in and go through that door. So based on that, and that is the diagram we have on the lower right side of the well actually on the upper right side, there is a specific requirement that it must be 18 inches clear on the latch side. Basically where the hardware is, you need 18 inches minimum clear for somebody to be able to move out of the way of that door, open the door, and go through that door. That's the general idea. Now, there are different requirements for the maneuvering clearances. I'm just going to go basically with the first two, the ones that are mostly used, which is the other one is the push on the push side. So that is if you're opening a door and pushing it again away from you, not towards you, but away from you. So in that case, when doors have both a closer and a latch, the doors are required to have 12 inches on that push side. That is basically from where the door ends, 12 inches, and that's on the side of the where the hardware is located, where the knob is located. So it should have no less than 12 inches. Again, these are minimums. Now, if the door does not have a closer, it does not have a latch, it's not required to have that. But in general, again, we should try to at least meet these minimum standards. Now, there are additional maneuvering clearances requirements for, because these two that we're talking about is when it is a forward approach to the door, when somebody is walking directly towards that door. There are additional requirements when somebody is walking parallel to a door, and we'll pull that door open or push it open, and at that point, there's just a big series of options that are available for that and requirements that have to be met, but those basically, it's just best to refer to the book than to go every single one of them because they're very complicated. Trust me, I've been looking at this for so many years and I still don't have them all in my mind, so that is definitely the best way to go, just to use a book and pretty much look at what the specific requirement is depending on the type of approach, because it can be either, it changes if it's on the hinge side, if it's on the latch side, and if it's on the pull or push, so they're just combination, options. So it's just best to look at the specific requirements. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, UFAS, and the main difference from the ADA requirement is that UFAS sets specific requirements for the dwelling units, and more importantly, for bathrooms and kitchens. So we are going to look at the specific requirements for the bathrooms and for the kitchens, and also for all the common spaces and facilities serving these accessible dwelling units. So think of it, if a unit will have accessible a parking space for it, it has to be accessible. If it has a mailbox, it has to be accessible. The clothes drying line that's in the backyard has to be accessible. So all these features that are related to that accessible dwelling unit must in turn also be accessible. Or even if there is think of it as a common laundry area, but it is the one that is designated for an accessible dwelling unit, then it should also be accessible. Excuse me. So the intent is to provide an accessible route to connect all these spaces and elements, and that goes back to the basic blocks that we had spoken about in the past of the accessible route, the width, the cross slope, and running slope. Okay, so now for the specific dwelling units, what we will see is that at least one full bathroom, including a lavatory, a toilet, a water closet, tub, or shower must be accessible. And basically that means providing one water closet with all the grab bars with the clear flow spaces, the lavatory mounted at the proper heights with clear flow spaces, and tubs or showers also at accessible heights and with the requisite dimensions. Also, for the sleeping areas in these units, basically what the requirement is that if it's a one-bedroom unit, that one bedroom must be accessible. If it has at least two bedrooms or more, then at least two bedrooms must be accessible. And by saying that it will be accessible, basically you have to have the requisite door width, the closets inside of them have to be accessible, hardware, and different elements also that we will see. Now, UFAS does allow for adaptability, and the concept of adaptability is reached by leaving the features in the units before the residents move in, and allowing for certain adaptability, basically to be able to install grab bars or fire alarm systems and elements as such. And also the counters, that the counters be provided within specific heights that are required under UFAS. And now, in the case for the Pensacola Area Housing Commission, we opted for providing fully accessible units, primarily because if you leave something that can be adaptable at a later date, there's also the possibility that the modifications might not be done right, and it might not be in compliance, and also going into the providing information for the consumer. So we opted for the option of providing accessible units, which ultimately will provide just the level of access that is required at this point. Okay, so different requirements as we mentioned. Okay, let's go into sinks. Basically, sinks should be no more than 34 inches above the finished floor to the top, and should have a knee clearance. And this knee clearance of 27 inches is another one of those building blocks that should be provided throughout, basically, for different elements. And we'll see it at the lavatories, at the sinks inside kitchens. So, and also at many counters, if it is required to have knee clearance, this will be another one of those building blocks who have that 27-inch knee clearance. Another element that has to be accessible in these lavatories is that if they have the exposed pipes, there should have an element covering these pipes to avoid somebody either getting burned or cut by the pipes underneath the sink. So all those hot and cold water drain pipes that are there should be covered. At the same time, the faucets, which many times if we look at a lot of the older ones, are probably not something that is operable with one fist, these faucets should be operable, and all the operable parts should be operable with one hand. Basically, a closed fist should not require tight pinching, grasping, or turning of the wrist to operate. That's the general concept behind that, to avoid, to facilitate somebody utilizing these elements. Also, if there are mirrors, the mirrors should be no more than 40 inches above the finished floor to the bottom of the reflecting surface, not to the frame, but to the reflecting surface. And again, that is the maximum. So if you can design below that, by all means do so. And it gives the option of basically providing and meeting that compliance. And there are different options to comply with this also. If a mirror is too high, basically a full-length mirror can be installed within the restroom, and to meet the standard, if it will imply too much work to basically tear up existing elements or something like that. Also, cabinets within these, like medicine cabinets, should be no more than 44 inches above the floor to the top of the bottom cabinet. So that's also a requirement if some of these mirrors have those built-in cabinets in them. Okay, another requirement that, and this is one that we'll find just throughout the facilities, is for the water closets. Okay, so the water closets, and this is actually a pretty tough standard to meet, is that they should be centered at 18 inches from the wall. Okay, and the height. And here we are looking at one of the water closets that can be in the common areas. In common areas, they are allowed to go between 17 inches to 19 inches above the floor to the top of the seat. Now, within the accessible dwelling units, these are allowed to go between 15 to 19 inches above the finished floor to the top of the seat. So there's a little bit more range for the accessible water closets in the dwelling units. And the idea behind these also is to allow, number one, to install backing to allow the installation of grab bars, one on the back wall and one on the side wall. The one behind the water closet should be a 36-inch long grab bar, and it's supposed to be mounted between 33 to 36 inches above the finished floor. And the water closet on the side wall is a 42-inch long unit, and that one should go at 12 inches from the back wall and at 54 inches minimum to the front. Now, sometimes it can get a little tricky meeting the 12 inches in the back and the 54 in the front. So also the option is just installing a longer grab bar. Installing a longer grab bar will allow that. You don't have to meet that 12 exactly. You can put it a little bit closer to the wall and go even a little bit more than the 54. And again, it helps us in meeting compliance for these water closets. These water closets are required clear floor space, just like the elements, like when we mentioned that a stationary a person on a stationary wheelchair required that 30 by 48 inch. So the clear floor space for water closets is usually 60 inches wide, and depending if it is floor mounted or if it is wall mounted. If it is wall mounted, it can be 56 inches. If it is floor mounted, it has to be 59 inches. So there are certain specific space requirements for these. Generally, when you are in the bathrooms, by providing the 60-inch turning space, these clear floor space requirements will be met. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on those. Okay, another element that is necessary in these accessible bathrooms is to either have a bathtub or a shower. In looking at these bathtubs, I mean, these are some of the specific requirements for the bathtubs. Number one, they have to have the grab bars. And as you can see from the diagrams, there's grab bar on the control wall, one on the back wall, and even one on the, well, on the head wall, basically on all three walls. And depending on the type, if it's the one on top, it has to have on all the three walls. If it's the one on the bottom, the one that has the seat in the back, it does not require a grab bar basically on the head wall, because that's where somebody would sit down, and you don't want to have a grab bar obstructing that seat in the tub. Also, something that is important to note is that these have to have a seat. If it's the one that is on top, it has to have a seat, and it doesn't have to be fixed. It can be something that can be installed, but that seat does have to be able to withstand 250 pounds of pressure. So just keep in mind that if you do purchase one of these seats, or right now if they're purchased and they're there, to keep them, or when purchasing new ones, that they have to withstand 250 pounds of pressure so they won't flip over and somebody won't be injured. I mean, that is just basically, let's say, like a risk factor in there. So definitely we have to keep that in mind. At the same time, the shower head. The shower head has to be 60 inches minimum, and basically that allows for, a greater level of access for somebody that's using the shower than just having a fixed shower head. So that element always has to be there. Another element is the controls. The controls, you can see there's a little hatched area, or that says a dotted line that says control area. The controls have to be mounted within the top of the tub rim and the grab bar, and they have to be offset towards the wide part of the shower. That's the ideal location for somebody to go ahead and set the controls before they get into that tub and use the tub. Also, again, like the clear floor space requirements for the single stationary wheelchair space and for the water closet, the bathtub also needs at least a minimum of 30 inches next to it, expanding the entire length of the tub for somebody to be able to use it. The other element that can be provided, and this personally I think provides a greater level of access, is the shower than the bathtub. The main reason why is because a lot of times in existing construction where the restrooms inside the dwelling units are basically tight or constricted in space, installing a shower such as the one in the bottom, the 30 by 60 inch shower, allows utilizing some of the clear floor space of that shower to provide the turning space within it. So that provides definitely a greater advantage over having a bathtub. That bathtub, when there are tight configurations, does not allow that, and unless the clear floor space is provided outside of that space, it basically restricts the use. Now, in the showers, they also have to have the grab bars, again, mounted between 33 to 36 inches above the finished floor, and they have to be, as you can see for the transfer shower, has to be 36 by 36 inches and has to have the grab bar on the control wall and on the side wall to allow for somebody to hold it and be able to transfer onto the seat. That transfer shower, the one that is indicated on top, has a seat which should be mounted at 18 inches above the finished floor so somebody can transfer onto it. Whereas the shower in the bottom, which is considered a roll-in shower, that one has to have grab bars on all three walls, so allowing somebody to be able to wheel into that shower. And the controls on this roll-in shower should be located on either one of the side walls, but not necessarily on the back wall. We'll see that this is another difference when we look at showers under the ADA. And these also require at least those 30 inches or 36 inches in front of them to provide the clear floor space, similar to the clear floor space for stationary wheelchairs for the water closet, for the tubs. The same applies to the roll-in shower, those same building blocks. Okay. When we look at kitchens, what elements are we trying to identify? If we are looking at a Section 504 kitchen, what we are looking for primarily is that if it is a U-shaped kitchen, basically configured as enclosed on all three sides, it must have 60-inch clear floor space between opposing cabinets, walls, and appliances. So that becomes a pretty big kitchen if you think of it. Whereas if it is just a pass-through kitchen that is open on both sides, it only requires 40 inches between opposing cabinets, walls, and or appliances. The idea also is to provide the 30-inch clear floor space that we have spoken about at each one of the appliances, the washer, the dryer, the refrigerator, the range, and also a specific requirement to provide a sink that has a 30 by 48 clear floor space below it, and that is the diagram B, where it is totally clear below that, so allows somebody to approach that sink in a forward manner and have that knee clearance that we had spoken about in the past and use that sink. Now, there are specific requirements for sink that the supporting structure for these sinks should be no more than 2 inches, and the sink should be no more than 6 inches deep, and to be able to provide access. And also it can be, the height can be adjustable, basically between 28, 32, and 36 are other options other than the 34, but primarily the one that is mostly utilized is the 34 inches. Now, there are also another requirement is to provide a work surface. A work surface is where somebody can think of it, can approach, have a folded approach to the cabinet, have that knee space below the cabinet, that 30 by 48 clear floor space, and be able to just chop their vegetables or anything they would like to do in their cooking process. And we're going to see some pictures of these, how these elements actually look in later on in the presentation. Cabinets can be provided below these elements as long as they are removable, and the floor is provided throughout, and everything is finished. So basically, cabinets and walls are finished, and as well as the flooring, but they would have to be removable as well, and provide instructions for the residents on how to use these elements. Okay, so that's pretty much in a nutshell the main requirements of under the UFAS standard. And now we're going to address and briefly the Fair Housing Act standards. So the Fair Housing Act basically applies this one, which is different from the UFAS, because this one applies not only to public entities but also applies to private housing. Think of it like condominiums, resorts, timeshares, things like that. It applies to them. Now it applies to the ones that have over 4 units and are for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. So it's, let's say, fairly newer construction than what the UFAS had. And also, what we will see in this one is that different from the UFAS and the Section 504 that just required that 5% to their basically to the housing programs, this one will cover certain units. Basically, if a building has an elevator, it will cover the units that have access to the elevators. When there are just 4 units on the lower level and no elevator, it will probably only cover those 4 units, that are within the public access. I'm not going to go in too much into detail into all the requirements of the FHA, because most of the buildings that the Area Housing Commission has are not really, they are covered by the Fair Housing Act guidelines, but they do not have to comply with it because they were built before the effective date of the FHA. What also something to keep in mind with the Fair Housing Act, and this is the difference like from the UFAS Section 504 that had the UFAS standard as accessible. Under the Fair Housing Act, there's like 10 safe harbors for compliance, so it becomes a little bit more tricky. And some of these are based like on ANSI, on the Fair Housing Act accessibility guidelines, and so forth. So it is a lot more complicated, if you will, to meet compliance, and it covers a lot more areas within these sites. Another important thing that the Fair Housing does establish is that the need to provide reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification. The reasonable accommodation being understood as a modification of policies and procedures, and a reasonable modification modifying actual premises. Now, the difference is, for example, a reasonable modification for a private entity, the owner, let's say a homeowner association, somebody will have to permit that the resident make the modification, and the cost will probably be carried by the resident, whereas under a public housing authority, somebody receiving federal funds and owning one of these, and if it's covered by the FHA, the likelihood is that the public housing authority will have to cover for these expenses, and unless it represents an undue financial administrative burden, or it is a change in the nature of the service. But that's where the difference lies in how it applies to public entities or private entities. The Fair Housing Act has 7 principles or specific requirements. Number 1, that the accessible building entrances be on an accessible route. So basically, think of this as providing a basic level of access from sidewalks to the entrance of the building, to the different buildings that are covered. And now, something that is important is that to understand that there are some exceptions, for a site test can be done, and there, something that called site impracticality can be issued, but these are, rare examples, and depending on, probably not something we're going to have much around here in Florida, where it mostly is, flat. Some parts up north are a little bit more hilly than others, but it's not too bad, let's say, if you will. The requirement number 2 is that accessible and usable public and common use areas. And basically, this is providing a sufficient number of amenities, if there are pools, if there are playgrounds, mailboxes, parking space, that all these elements, features be on an accessible route and they be accessible to persons with disabilities, and they be accessible from the accessible units. Also, another one is the usable doors. In usable doors, well, we'll see the main difference from the UFAS standard that we spoke about previously is that the UFAS standard just set straightforward that a door had to be 32 inches minimum, and that's an absolute. Here, the 32 inches is a nominal, so a door like 31/5/8 can be accessible, can be usable. See, the concept is usable, it's not accessible. So basically what you will see is that the fair housing provides a usable, where the units can be adaptable and made accessible, but they are not fully accessible, whereas the Section 504 UFAS units, those are deemed to be accessible. Also, an accessible route must be provided into and throughout the covered units, and this is connecting basically the spaces such as living room, dining room, the bedrooms and bathrooms. Some of these units are allowed to have features such as raised or sunk living areas or mezzanines, but basically you have to go into each one of these cases and determine what has to be provided as accessible. Requirement number 5 is that light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, environmental controls must be in accessible locations. And here we will see that under the FHA, the requirement for the height is 48 inches. They don't allow going to that 54 inches like UFAS did. So that's why, again, why we stress that most of these accessible elements should be located at the 48 inches. Another requirement under the FHA is that the walls be reinforced for later installation of grab bars. And in this case, because it is more of a usable or adaptable requirement, the grab bars can be installed, they can be either floor mounted, wall mounted, and there's a specific requirement to install that backing, but the grab bars will not have to meet technical specifications just like the UFAS requirement does. I mean, they're not as stringent, if you will. They're a little bit more flexible. And then also the requirement number 7, which is for usable kitchens and bathrooms. Now, for usable kitchens and bathrooms, in the kitchens, they will require specifically providing a clear floor space at appliances, at the sink, at the washer, dryer, at the range, and refrigerator, and providing a level of circulation into these elements, whereas in not as stringent as the UFAS that requires that specific clear floor space at the sink and the work surface below these elements. Now, for the bathrooms, under bathrooms, it will have different configurations. They have like a bathroom type A and type B, and according to the bathroom that is chosen, these bathrooms are not required, again, because they're adaptable and they're usable, they're not required to have the 60-inch turning space, but more of a clear floor space at each one of the fixtures, at the sink, for the water closet, and for the tub or shower. And the configurations, either type A or type B, will be depending on how the clear floor space is provided at the tub, if it's for forward approach or for a parallel approach. But again, just different types of layouts, and these are adaptable more than being considered as something as accessible as the ones under the UFAS standard. Now we go to another standard, which is the Americans with Disability Act. The Americans with Disability Act follows the same principles of the other ones, basically prohibiting discrimination on basis of disability, and also applies to program services and activities of public entities. And there are different titles under the Americans with Disability Act, Title 1, 2, and 3, for example. Title 1 being applicable for employment, Title 2 for public entities, such as the Pensacola Area Housing Commission, and Title 3 for public accommodation. So again, it's broader. It also applies to private, basically to businesses throughout. So as we can see, that the requirements for each one, we saw 504 was more for federal. The ADA is covering basically private entities and public entities as well. So they have different levels of scoping and coverage. And under the ADA, the difference as well, now what is defined as accessible under the ADA varies because they define as accessible the UFAS as well as the ADA. So the public entities have that option of going with either one of these two standards. And now this was based on the 1992 standard, on the previous standard. Now we already have the 2010 standard. And under these, basically, they differentiated basically new construction alterations, existing construction, and even historical properties. So basically, the new construction had to be fully compliant. Alterations have to meet the new construction standard to the maximum extent feasible, and existing construction that has to perform barrier removal, similar to the concept of program accessibility for the public housing authorities. And historical construction, basically, that is given a little bit more lenient, just like in slopes for ramps, just because you don't want to do anything that threatens or destroys the historic value of these properties. But primarily for a public entity, what it has to follow, and somebody such as Pensacola Area Housing Commission, when most of these facilities are built, they have to comply with what is called program access. So they have to provide a level of access that the programs and service, when viewed in its entirety, are readily accessible to persons with disabilities. And in that sense, they don't have to modify every single one of their facilities, but they have to provide a basic level that is comparable to a person that does not have a disability, if you will. And also, under the ADA, it sets specific transition plan requirements similar to the ones under Section 504, basically identifying deficiencies, methods to mitigate the barriers, a schedule to implement these changes, and determining the official responsible for these changes. Now, that was the 1992 ADA, but now we already have the 2010 ADA that basically, the 2010 ADA has now come to supersede everything. There is a grandfather clause, for elements built on or before, well, I think this could have been an issue here, the March 15, 2012, basically the public entities had the option of going with either the UFAS standard, the ADA standard, or meeting the 2010 ADA. Now at this point, after March 15, 2010, any construction has to be, the requirement is to try to meet the 2010 standard. So basically the 92 standard is set in the past, and now moving forward we have to meet that 2010 ADA. So what the grandfather clause or the safe harbor does is that elements that were in compliance with the previous standards before the effective date, they do not have to be modified, at least right now. Now, if at one point the entity decides to touch or modify these elements, at that point it has to bring them into compliance. What the 2010 standards do is that, well, they're not specifically addressing existing facilities unless the entities decide to modify their facilities. It is trying to consolidate all of these different standards, as we have seen, the UFAS, the building codes, into one single element that can be used across the board. So that is why moving forward, we'll see that most of the building codes are actually just, accepting this as well, and it's going to be adopted by everybody. As I mentioned before, HUD has not issued a statement adopting this, but I think we're looking forward to that. Hopefully we will be hearing something from them in the future. Additionally, what this does is that it covers a lot of gray areas that were not here in the past. It provides guidance for children requirements to differentiate, because most of the dimensions under the ADA are based on adult anthropometrics, basically for, larger persons, and did not cover the children. So now this guidance is out for children. This new in the 2010 does have specific areas covering residential facilities and residential dwelling units under sections 233 and 809. I'm not going to go too much into detail on these. We're still trying to stick to the UFAS standard for the most of it for your facilities, and most of the elements, if covered under this, will also be compliant with both. So we'll see that as we move along. Also, other areas that are covered are recreational facilities and areas such as swimming pools, and I don't know if you are all aware, but also this has been a big issue, lately, that the fact of having to install pool lifts at each of the pools, which many people have basically expressed their concerns about it being, an undue burden on them. So that has been set aside for now. It's under basically a 60-day grace period, and we'll probably go into comment or something like that, but that's something coming in the future. Okay, so basically what this does, the ADA, is that it has all this new scoping and technical requirements, like as we mentioned, the pools, the residential, but it also varies, from the previous requirements, from the previous ADA standard, and even from the UFAS standard. So as you can see, like before, the 1992 standard required that out of the parking spaces, the accessible parking spaces, 1 out of every 8 had to be van accessible. Now it's 1 out of every 6. So there's a change there. The water closet, clear floor space, before, the requirements allowed having a lavatory next to the water closet. Now the clear floor space has to be 60 inches wide clear from that space, which is something that was also incorporated into the Florida Building Code, like the 97. So at least moving forward, that kind of helps a bit. Also the center line. Remember how we had mentioned that the center line requirement was very strict, that it had to be 18 inches dead on from the wall to the center of the, now it provides a range between 16 to 18. So that certainly helps, in many cases where it was hard to meet that standard. Giving this range will allow for more of these to be, in compliance. Hopefully now, because it is a range, it is not allowed to give, construction tolerance beyond these numbers, but hopefully a lot more of water closets will fall within this category. And also for the signage, for example, under the previous ADA, it was at 60 inches. Now it's giving a range from between 48 to 60 inches above the finished floor. So as we see, there are differences in scoping and in these technical requirements. Okay, now, and briefly, also, since we are in Florida, construction that is done here has to comply with the Florida Building Code. And the Florida Building Code has adopted the 2010 ADA. So, and this is now effective as of March 15, 2012. So all the new construction will have to not only comply with basically the federal standard, but also the new standard that has been adopted under the Florida Building Code under Chapter 11. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the broad overview of all of the specific requirements, for the for the housing authorities. I try to keep it simple, but obviously once I get started, it seems like we get a little bit carried away here. But we're going now just look into the effect of these on the public housing authority and the cross coverage, as we had mentioned. So, for example, for existing facilities, some could be subject to Section 504 requirements and have to comply with that 5% requirement for units designed for accessible dwelling units and 2% for sensory units. And while other areas like the ADA, as we mentioned, that covered public accommodations, could apply to leasing offices. And that this is for something that was existing. Now, if something was newly constructed, that's basically after the 1991 date, it might have to comply not only with Section 504 with the ADA, but also with FHA. If this receives federal fund, if it's new at this point, and if it has more than 4 units in the elevator, so the Section 504 applies, requires the 5% of the units, requires 2% of the units for persons with sensory impairments, and the remainder of the units have to comply with the FHA requirements. So there's a cross coverage, and it gets a little bit tricky. Thankfully, most of the properties under the Pensacola, I believe, are not falling under this requirement, but that's kind of so you have an idea of how these requirements come into play. So what happens at this point, basically? At this point, moving forward, and this is really what the role of members of the Pensacola Area Housing Commission and your specific role will be, is that the steps, the wheels are in movement now, and the steps are being taken right now to make these units accessible. So we have gone through a process of self-evaluation, and we have looking into basically the modifications that need to be done, which can be 2 types basically: non-structural modifications and structural modifications. The non-structural modifications are basically modifications to policy and procedures and that type to meet accessibility, and the structural modifications are the ones that are also being implemented right now in many of the sites of the Pensacola Area Housing Commission sites. You see those units that are being renovated. That is to meet compliance. So the questions we basically have to ask ourselves are basically, Are the programs and services compliant? Are the policies and procedures compliant? And is the facility compliant? Are we providing equal opportunity to persons with disabilities? Are we not discriminating? So we're just going to briefly go over this, and this will probably be part of the afternoon session. And this one is the one intended primarily for the administrative personnel. Basically, if the policy and procedures must be reviewed and determine what deficiencies there are, posting compliance with the ADA, designating an ADA coordinator, establishing grievance procedures, reviewing applications, interview, the specific questions that can be made throughout this process, verifying that there is an effective communication with the persons with disabilities, disclaimers under fair housing, verifying if we're meeting these fair housing policies and procedures, reviewing how the waiting list is handled, the priorities, and the different options, reviewing the contract terms, conditions, and privileges, and modification of these contract terms, policies, and procedures. Now this we're going to cover in the afternoon, so we're not going to focus on too much now. And after these elements have been reviewed, also another important part will be to basically perform a needs assessment. Basically if the current housing needs are being met, if those minimum thresholds that were established by the federal guidelines, are those sufficient, or is there a greater need for these units? We can do this by looking at the applicant list and obtaining information on the disability needs. Basically the usage, are the units that are designed for persons with mobility impairments used by persons with mobility impairments, or the ones for sensory impairments as well. We can look at census data. Basically, is there a large population of persons with disability in the area? Do we need to go more, or are we covered just with that minimum 5%? We can perform interviews with local advocate organizations and get their feedback if their needs are being met. As we mentioned, do these, the question is, if these units that are being provided meet that minimum required under the federal, will that suffice, or will there be an additional need? And also, when reasonable accommodations are requested, when modifications to the units are required, are we capturing this? Do we have this information? Do we know which units that are above and beyond these minimum required by the federal requirements have these features? Which ones are they, and what features they have? So just to keep these kind of in the back of their head and program for the future, just kind of forecast what the future of the will bring and how to accommodate these needs. So that takes us to the final step of our presentation, which is basically the the structural modifications to the facility and the evaluation. Basically, as we were seeing, what we did is that we performed an assessment to determine if these current housing facilities were accessible. We determined some deficiencies that needed to be mitigated in the number of units and in the features within the units, and based on that, we designed a transition plan, basically to establish which units had to be accessible, to have that information available for all personnel so everybody is on the same page, and to modify the existing ones to make them accessible. The general goal of this is basically to provide comparable choices of living arrangements for persons with disabilities, that they have equal service to those that do not have disabilities. And also, we not only have to look at the housing programs, the dwelling units themselves, but also non-housing programs, basically any other, areas, as we mentioned, accessible routes, parking spaces, community centers, mailboxes, laundry, clothes drying lines, the leasing offices, and also any programs that the Housing Commission might offer. If there was a program that is, let's say, for first-time home buyers or something like that, is this being offered to all, not only persons with do persons that have disabilities have equal access to these programs? So those are the type of things that we need to look out for in this program accessibility. And now we're going to go into the specifics of how we need to perform this ongoing barrier removal and the obligations of and maintenance of all these accessible features. Okay, the first step that we analyzed was if the Pensacola Area Housing Commission met the 5% and 2% that we have been talking about. And based on that, we had that chart that you probably cannot see it under this. Obviously the font is fairly small, but this is something that has been provided to the Housing Commission, and it will be accessible to all the employees, so everybody will know which units are designated accessible for persons with mobility impairments, which is for persons with hearing and vision impairments, and the ones that are currently being modified by the contractors, and the dates when these will be finished. And basically now, after this, reaching that goal of program accessibility, that the program, when viewed in its entirety, is accessible to persons with disabilities. The idea also behind this was to comply with Section 504 to provide those comparable choices of living arrangements following size, amenities, and dispersion throughout the city. This takes us to the final phase, basically, of our presentation, which is some of the diagrams. And these, basically, I opted to put different photos, not specifically of the Pensacola Area Housing Commission, but of different areas, just so you can see that these are, let's say, common issues that different housing authorities have throughout the country. As we can see in the photo on the left-hand corner, basically, that is an accessible parking space, and you can see it has an access aisle, but there is no curb ramp provided from that parking space. So therefore, somebody in a wheelchair cannot navigate from that parking space up to the facilities, and therefore it defeats the purpose, if you will, of that vehicle. In this case, they have to navigate, walk, or wheel behind other parked vehicles other than their own, and that can also be a hazard, and that is required under the Florida Building Code, which had a more stringent requirement than the federal. That is not allowed, and that was something that would create a issue of non-compliance and conflict. On the photo on the right, we can see the two parking spaces. They have been striped. They have that curb ramp provided, and somebody can have access. And you can also see that curb ramp and that parking space is in the closest path of travel to the door of the accessible dwelling unit. It also has the sign posted. So these are elements that are pretty much like clear giveaways when we know that we are meeting compliance or not. The parking spaces have slopes or are not striped properly. If they do not have sign, these are clear issues that there is some area for improvement. Other elements that are very common is parking spaces or access aisles having these built-up curb ramps. Okay, these built-up curb ramps were implemented at one point or another, but these are really not compliant. I mean, this is not supposed to be in the access aisle. So what is happening in the photo on the left side, that is not the right way to do it. It should be done like something like what is happening on the right side, where an access aisle is provided, and then there is a curb ramp from that point up to the sidewalk into the accessible unit. Think of this as, remember what we spoke about earlier, the yellow brick road coming from those parking spaces and now going to the, in this example of the ramp, going into the leasing office. As you can see, that ramp, we spoke about this, again, something very common, very typical. A ramp has been provided, but as you can see, there are only handrails on one side of the ramp. So again, handrails must be on both sides of the ramp. Most have those extensions, and under the UFAS standard, between 30 to 34 inches above the finished floor to the top, and have that 1.5 inch diameter on those handrails. Now, on the picture on the right side, you can see that a ramp was created to provide access to that unit, to that accessible dwelling unit. However, because a ramp was created and that ramp rises greater than 6 inches, it should have had the handrails again, and no handrails were provided in that case. Here's another example of how some features that are provided for units and are just basically left out. That yellow brick road has not been provided to these mailboxes, so the person residing in this unit does not have access to that mailbox. Whereas one of us could just walk up and pick up our mail, that person will not be able to wheel. I mean, he's not required to wheel under this grass, which is not a stable surface, which is a regular surface, and would obstruct him from traversing through it. So basically what has to happen is that an accessible route has to be provided a clear floor space, one of those 30 by 48 clear floor space, so somebody can stop, get their mailbox, and go back to their unit. Here's another element, and this one also happens, is typical, is we'll see where closed drying line are provided for some of these units. as you can see, the closed drying line is way in the back, far away from that slab on the grade there. So what needs to happen is a accessible route has to be provided, the yellow brick road to that closed drying line, and provide that clear flow space there. And not only that, but also the closed drying line is mounted at 66 inches above the finished floor. So again, that needs to be lowered either to that 54 inches or preferably to the 48 inches above the finished floor, so it can be usable by a person in a wheelchair. Takes us to other elements that, as I mentioned, right now, as many of these units are being modified and are made accessible, so we won't have to worry about that for now, let's say. But what happens is that all this ongoing barrier removal, it's an obligation to maintain these accessible features. So basically, as we can see there, the sidewalk, the grass needs to be cut. You need to keep these features, but basically think of it, if there's a tree and there's a root, and that root creates a change in level in the sidewalk with a step of over an inch or something, that can become a tripping hazard. Not only is it from an accessibility point of view a barrier, but also from a life safety risk management point of view also, it creates an obstruction where somebody can trip and hurt themselves. So obviously maintaining cutting grass, maintaining the sidewalks, restriping accessible parking spaces if they're old and faded, or also other elements which can be like temporary sidewalk interruptions within the sites. These elements, it is necessary to provide an alternative route to the features, to the laundry area and such, in areas such as that. Other elements, basically, like for example, within the leasing office, the counters, when they are mounted too high, all these counters, and you will see like on the example, like on the right side, should be no more than 36 inches above the finished floor. Should have alternatives such as the clipboard or something like that. So somebody, when they go and inquire for information at that time of that interview or that application, they have access to these services. If not, we're just up front denying straightforward the services there. Other elements that we did not discuss much about, but is like the signage for the units also. And there are different requirements. Well, they vary between the UFAS standard and the ADA standard, but in general, if we try to follow the more stringent, and provide, raised characters with braille and mounted at 60 inches above the finished floor to a center or within those parameters, one that can meet both the UFAS standard and the A standard will comply and provide access to everybody. As we also spoke about the door requirements, having the notification device where somebody that is inside that unit, if we install, like in the picture on the left side, you see it actually has two viewing holes. One that is, let's say, roughly about at 58 inches above the finished floor. That cannot be used by somebody in a wheelchair. Whereas if it has a lower viewing hole, that can be used by a person in a wheelchair, and will provide them an opportunity to see who is outside if they need to, maintaining privacy and safety. So having those viewing holes, having the hardware on it, having that signage in the right sign, all these features help make these units accessible. Now we're getting into the interior of the units as well, and looking at some of these kitchens. And basically, when we look at some of these, in this case, at least they had a little bit more space on the one on the left side. But as you can see, the cabinet, the sink, does not provide that knee space that we spoke about, that 30 by 48 clear flow space. Below that, it's not there. Whereas on the picture on the right side, as you can see, the work surface, there is a work surface there, and there's a clear flow space below the sink. And these spaces have to have that 30-inch minimum width, so somebody can approach them in a forwarded approach and use the sink and use that work surface. And also the pipes, we can see how the pipes underneath that sink have been covered. Here's another example, and certainly, not only providing the 60-inch turnaround space within the kitchen or that 40-inch as required, but also providing that work surface. And if you have a space below these burners, that is not a work surface. The work surface just has to be exactly that, a work surface, not something where somebody can be burned by the burners. Also, when looking at these the controls, as you can see, they're off to the side. That's how they should be, because otherwise, if somebody has to reach across the burners, they can burn themselves again. And also providing alternative for like the range hood, you see those controls in the bottom. That was also an option to provide access to these the range hood at within an accessible reach range. Now, when we go into bathrooms, and certainly, I mean, these are probably not the worst cases, but you can see, like in the one on the left side, we can't even see a grab bar for that water closet. So you can see the sink, the pipes are exposed, has those two supporting structures. Those do not provide the knee clearance. You know, there are different elements there that are out of compliance. So what we are looking for is something more like what is on the right side, which has the rear grab bar for the water closet. This is the right grab bar for the water closet. On the side wall has the flush control towards the wall side. The water closet is at the center line at 18 inches from that side wall, and the height between 15 to 19. The lavatory has the knee clearance, has the pipes covered, the mirror is okay. So different elements that we saw all the technical specifications for. Now, within that restroom, as we can see now, here are some of the showers. In the case on the left side, we can't see the controls there. That, you know, the grab bar, which is probably not continuous. So we have different features that are just not there. Whereas with the shower on the right side, on that shower, basically we do have control. We have the grab bars on all the walls. The controls are in the proper location. The shower head has that 60-inch hose that we spoke about. So therefore, it provides more features of accessibility for the residents in that unit. Also, for the case of the bathtubs, as we can see on the picture on the left side, for that one, basically, it is missing grab bars. It does not have a seat. Not clear if that is the shower head there or if the controls are in the right place. But when we look at the tub on the right side, we do see that it has a seat there. It has the proper grab bars, has the shower head, and the controls are within the proper area. So those are the type of features, the elements that you are going to be looking for. I mean, if you see that, because like I said, you know, right now, if all these accessible units are made, they will be in compliance, but you have to think of the upkeep as well. You know, in the future, if these grab bars are missing, you want to install them at the proper place. You want to see if those shower heads are still there, if the seat is still there, these elements to maintain those features in inoperable and working conditions. The last, also we haven't addressed much, is the units that are designed for persons with vision and hearing impairments, as well as, so this is the 2%, the first, these that, the slides that we have looked up to now were for the units designed for persons with mobility impairments. Now, in the units designed for persons with vision and hearing impairments, what are we looking for? We're looking primarily for like the fire alarms, that they have to provide both an audible and a visual notification, the door notification, such as what we saw in one of the previous photos, that it does provide somebody that's inside is able to see who is outside, and it is at an accessible height. Also, this can be achieved by providing the doorbell and providing a system inside that it can provide both an audible and a visual notification. But these two cannot be tied. The door and the fire alarm cannot be tied. That must be clear, because obviously that would definitely create a problem for the residents. So they have to be separate elements that must be located within the dwelling unit. And another one, you know, can be, you know, telephone notification, basically providing a system where people can connect their TTY, where these telephones, if provided, they do provide not only an audible or a visual appliance, so somebody inside that unit can hear these elements. Okay, and then on these photos, we see some of the smoke detectors that are provided, and these are single, these are probably single standalone in the first case. In the second case, the fire alarm does provide both an audible and a visual appliance. And that is in a nutshell most of the requirements that are applicable to the housing, and we have seen both the requirements and the we have seen the requirements in the photos and how they apply to the units. What we are going to do right now is basically we're going just over a summary of what we have covered in this, and I am going to open the floor for questions. Basically, if you have, I have not seen that any has been submitted, but definitely it would be good if you do have any questions. I will open the mics, and hopefully at that point you can express any questions that you have. So basically, to summarize the steps, number one is performing the self-evaluation, developing the transition plan, which is the phase that we are all in right now, take part in. Evaluate the programs and services, the policies and procedures, the facilities, which is primarily your area, and facilities, basically the premises, the sidewalks, the offices, the paths of travel, the dwelling units themselves. Elements to use for these, HUD has different checklists for the facilities. There's also a DOJ toolkit for state and local governments. These elements can be used when assessing the facilities. Certainly, we are here also to assist you. I mean, any questions that you might have, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email with any question or anything that I can help. I would gladly do so. Also, try to reach within all this a level of public outreach, basically having access to the advocate organizations, sending them basically information that the transition plan is being implemented, so we can get feedback from them and their feel, basically if they agree, any suggestions that they might have, and as part of the outreach, trying to offer also, okay, if the units will be out and are available, trying to reach these advocate groups and see if they are interested in pursuing or trying to qualify for one of these units. Another element, employee training, such as what we are doing right now. Definitely, I'm glad that Abe thought about this opportunity and we were able to give this to all of you members. And we understand that sometimes there's a turnover in employees, or new persons are brought onto the team, and they as well should be. We should all be on the same page and following these requirements and trying to comply with them. And also the monitoring the plan, basically, as I said, whatever modifications are done right now, we have to know that they have to maintain the inoperable conditions. If we do alterations to anything, know that if we're modifying a door hardware, that we will install that lever hardware. And moving forward, when you do these changes, if you do them at that time, that is when it is most cost effective for the housing authority, and it provides that additional level of access for everybody. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. The materials that we covered today, basically we covered Section 504, we covered 2010 ADA, we spoke about the 92 ADA, the UFAS, elements to use for that, like the UFAS checklist, the Fair Housing Act, and the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, and the Florida Building Code. So these are most of the items that we covered today. And at this point, pretty much what I can recommend, these are different websites. Obviously, the HUD website, the Access Board website is a good. Also, there's the Southeast Center, the Region 4. They also provide guidance on elements, and they have also some free training, and that can be helpful if it's necessary to further, the knowledge in these elements. Fair Housing Accessibility First is a great website also. This provides a lot of information, very helpful, and guidance in the materials that, relating to Fair Housing Act. Also, the Access Board, actually Access Board and Department of Justice, in these websites, you will find basically all the guidance we have been talking about, the UFAS standard, the ADA standards, the checklist that can be used, and a lot of information there. And also another one is there's the National Fair Housing Training Academy. They offer intensive courses. These are even for weeks in fair housing. So if somebody is interested in, obviously, in increasing their knowledge in this, those are definitely good places to go.